At 2 in the morning, the club finally exhaled. The last of the laughter had faded. The final glasses had been cleared. The chandeliers above the main floor had dimmed into a softer amber glow, leaving the private rooms in pools of half-light and shadow. The scent of cigar smoke, expensive perfume, and old whiskey still hung in the air like the memory of a secret. Catherine Bell was the last waitress still working. She usually was. That was how life had become for her, always the last one standing, the last one cleaning, the last one carrying what other people left behind. The club was called the Velvet Room, though no one in the city said the name casually. Men with money came there. Men with political ambition came there. Men with blood on their hands came there. And over all of it, whether spoken or unspoken, hovered one name like a shadow over the city. Thomas Morty. Owner. King. Ghost. Executioner. Depending on who was speaking. Catherine had worked at the Velvet Room for 10 months and had seen Thomas Morty only a handful of times. He moved through the building the way storms moved over water, quiet from a distance, but everybody felt the pressure change. He had never spoken more than 3 words to her. She preferred it that way. Invisible was safer. Invisible paid the rent. Invisible bought medicine. Invisible kept her younger brother alive. She adjusted the strap of the cleaning tote on her shoulder and stepped into VIP Lounge 3, one of the rooms reserved for the city's most private meetings. The heavy velvet curtains were half drawn. The low table was littered with crystal tumblers, melted ice, cigar ash, and the expensive carelessness of men who had never cleaned up after themselves. Catherine moved through the room in silence, collecting glasses one by one. A lipstick-stained tumbler. A folded napkin with a phone number written in red ink. A gold lighter someone had forgotten. She worked automatically, her body moving while her mind drifted somewhere else toward overdue bills, hospital invoices, and the message she'd received that morning from St. Agnes Cardiac Center. Payment reminder. Final notice. Her brother, Ali, was 9 years old and waiting for surgery that felt both urgent and impossible. Every shift she worked, every tray she carried, every hour her feet ached, it all had one purpose. Keep him alive 1 more month. Then 1 more. Then 1 more. She crouched beside the leather sectional to retrieve a silk scarf that had fallen under the couch. Her fingers brushed the fabric. Then stopped. There was something else under there. Something cold. Metal. She frowned and reached deeper into the darkness. When she pulled her hand back, a small silver device rested in her palm. A voice recorder. Compact. Scratched. Professional enough that it didn't belong to a careless drunk. And on one side of it, a tiny green light blinked. Still active. Still recording. Catherine stared at it. For 1 long second, the room became very still. She should have put it back. That was the correct decision, the safe decision, the decision made by women who survived places like this. Put it back. Stand up. Walk out. Forget. But her thumb had already moved before her caution could stop it. She pressed play. A burst of static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then, a man's voice filled the empty room. Smooth. Calm. Educated. Kind of voice that never needed to raise itself to be obeyed. And Catherine felt the blood leave her face almost instantly. She knew that voice. Everyone in the club knew it. Victor Salazar. Thomas Morty's senior advisor. His strategist. His oldest confidant. The man employees described with words like gracious and measured and refined. The man who always remembered birthdays. The man who tipped well. The man who asked servers if they were eating enough. The voice on the recorder said quietly. Saturday, 11:30, after the last guest leaves. Catherine stopped breathing. The recording continued. He'll be alone. He always is at the end. Thomas likes ritual. 1 final drink after the room clears, 1 moment of silence before he disappears upstairs. Men like him think routine is control. But routine is how you learn where to place the knife. Catherine's hand tightened around the recorder so hard it hurt. Another voice, fainter, nervous, said something she couldn't fully make out. Victor answered with a small laugh. Compound is already prepared. Colorless. Odorless. Dissolves in under 5 seconds. It will mimic a cardiac event. By the time anyone understands what happened, the body will already be under our control. The room seemed to tilt around her. Her knees nearly gave way. She sat down hard on the edge of the couch, still holding the recorder like it might burn through her skin. The voice kept going. Not rushed. Not emotional. Not wild. That was the part that terrified her most. He wasn't angry. He wasn't ranting. He was discussing murder the way accountants discussed quarterly forecasts. There will be no bullets, no spectacle, no war. That would invite questions. This will be elegant. By sunrise, the board will stabilize under new leadership, the accounts will transfer, and the men in Naples will have what they paid for. Catherine shut her eyes. No, 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 no. This wasn't a drunken fantasy or a meaningless threat. This was a plan, structured, funded, timed. A real one. A voice, she recognized, was calmly laying out the murder of one of the most feared men in the city. And somehow, impossibly, that knowledge was now sitting in her hand. She should stop listening. She should destroy it. She should leave. Instead, she listened to every second. Victor detailed the time. The whiskey. The isolation. The transfer of money already sent offshore. The internal loyalties already bought. The names of men who would move once Thomas Morty was dead. Some were strangers to Catherine. Some were not. One of them made her stomach drop even lower. Bianca Morty. Thomas's fiancée. A socialite heiress with a face made for magazine covers and a smile too perfect to trust. Catherine had seen Bianca in the club 3 times. Every single time the room had bent around her. And now, if the recorder was real, Bianca wasn't simply beside power. She was part of the blade aimed at its throat. When the recording finally clicked off, the silence in the room felt heavier than sound. Catherine stared at the dead recorder in her hand. Her breathing was shallow. Her pulse was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She knew what this meant. And worse. She knew what it could cost. Because there were only 2 roads in front of her now. The first was silence. She could slide the recorder back beneath the couch exactly where she'd found it. Walk out. Block out. Go home. Wake up tomorrow and return to work as if she had heard nothing at all. Thomas Morty would die on Saturday night. And Catherine Bell would remain alive. Invisible. Employed. Useful to her brother. Maybe that was the right answer. Maybe men like Thomas Morty died every day in cities like this and the world kept turning. Maybe one criminal killing another wasn't her moral burden to carry. Maybe survival was enough. But the second road was harder. And it was the one already pressing against her conscience like a blade. If she said nothing, then she would know. She would know she had heard it. Known it. Held a man's death in her hand and chosen to look away. Catherine lowered her head into her hands. She was not brave. She was not reckless. She was not the kind of woman who charged into danger because righteousness demanded it. She was tired. 28 years old. Working double shifts. Living in a studio apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that screamed in winter. She had once studied forensic accounting before life had ripped the future out of her hands. After their mother died and Ellie got sick, school became a luxury she could no longer afford. So she dropped out. Took whatever jobs she could. And became excellent at disappearing. But numbers had stayed with her. Patterns. Irregularities. Systems. The way lies hid inside paperwork and timing. It was a skill she almost never used now. A skill no one in this club would ever guess she possessed. And suddenly, against her will, every detail she'd just heard was already arranging itself inside her mind like evidence on a board. Transferred funds. Internal betrayal. Poison instead of force. No public blood. No loose ends. This wasn't just a murder. It was a succession event. A hostile takeover disguised as natural death. Her stomach twisted. She looked down at the recorder again. Then whispered into the empty room, "What am I supposed to do with you?" No one answered. Only the hush of central air through hidden vents. Only the dim golden light. Only the weight of a decision that had found the wrong woman at the wrong hour. Or maybe the only woman left with a conscience. Catherine rose slowly to her feet. She slipped the recorder into the deep pocket of her black apron. Its weight settled against her hip like a warning. Then she gathered the rest of the glasses with hands that no longer felt entirely steady and stepped into the hallway. The corridor outside the AP Lounge 3 was empty. Muted sconces threw long shadows over dark wallpaper and polished wood. Her shoes clicked softly against the floor as she walked toward the staff room. Halfway there, she froze. 2 men in black suits stood at the far end of the corridor. Thomas Morty's security. Not club bouncers. Not event staff. The real ones. They weren't speaking. They were simply waiting. One of them lifted his gaze and met hers. Then said, in a voice flat as stone, "Miss Bell." Every muscle in her body locked. The recorder in her apron pocket suddenly felt 10 times heavier. The man stepped forward once. "The boss wants to see you." Catherine's mouth went dry. She tried to swallow and couldn't. "Now?" The guard did not blink. "Now." Her mind exploded with possibilities all at once. They know. Someone saw her. A camera caught her. Victor already knows the recorder is gone. This is it. This is where invisible girls disappear. She forced her voice not to shake. Did I do something wrong?" Neither man answered. One of them merely turned and gestured for her to follow. Catherine stood very still for one final second. Then she started walking. Because in places like this, when powerful men summoned you after midnight, you learned quickly that refusal was just another way of arriving dead. The guards led her away from the main corridor, past the employee lockers, past the accounting office, and toward a private elevator she had never been allowed to use. As they moved, Catherine saw someone standing near the corner of the hall speaking quietly to a hostess manager. Victor Salazar. He looked up at the exact moment she passed. Their eyes met. Only for a second. But in that second, Catherine felt something cold move down her spine. His expression didn't change. His smile remained gentle. Pleasant. Interested. But his eyes sharpened. As if he had noticed something. As if he had sensed the air change. Then, just as quickly, he looked away and resumed his conversation. Catherine kept walking. Her heart was now pounding so hard she thought the guards might hear it. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. The guards ushered her inside. No one spoke on the ride up. The numbers climbed in silence. Sublevel. Ground. 2. 3. 4. Private. When the doors finally opened, Catherine stepped into a different world. No music. No guests. No velvet. No illusion. Just a wide corridor lined with dark wood, museum, level art, and silence expensive enough to feel dangerous. At the end of it stood a single closed door. One of the guards knocked twice. A pause. Then, a voice from inside. Low. Controlled. Male. Send her in. The door opened. Catherine stepped across the threshold. And for the first time in her life, she came face to face with Thomas Morty. He was seated behind a broad black desk near a wall of windows overlooking the sleeping city. No crowd. No bodyguards. No mythology. Just a man in a charcoal suit with his jacket off, sleeves rolled once, a crystal glass untouched beside him, and eyes so still they made her instantly understand why grown men feared disappointing him. He was more handsome than rumor allowed. And somehow colder. Dark hair. Sharp jaw. A faint scar near his mouth. A face built equally for seduction and violence. But it was his eyes that held her. Not cruel. Not wild. Worse. Discipline. A man who had survived by learning how to feel less than everyone else in the room. He looked at her for several seconds without speaking. Catherine stood in front of his desk, trying not to tremble. Then Thomas Morty finally said, "You were in Lounge 3 after close." It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Catherine swallowed. "Yes, sir." His gaze lowered briefly. To her apron pocket. Then returned to her face. "And you found something under my couch." The room went silent. And Catherine realized, with a chill that reached her bones. Thomas Morty already knew. The silence stretched so long it began to feel like something alive. Catherine stood in front of the desk, her pulse loud in her ears, her thoughts racing too fast to hold on to any one of them. She hadn't planned for this moment. She hadn't prepared words. She hadn't imagined that the most dangerous man in the city would look directly at her and already know. Thomas Morty leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers loosely interlaced, his expression unchanged. "Most people," he said quietly, "would have put it back." Catherine's throat tightened. "I know. They would have walked out," he continued, "gone home and decided it wasn't their problem. I know." His gaze sharpened just slightly. "And yet," he said, "you didn't. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't praise. It was curiosity. That, somehow, was worse." Catherine's hand moved before she could stop it. Slowly, carefully, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small silver recorder. It felt heavier now. Colder. She stepped forward and placed it on the desk between them. The soft click of metal against polished wood sounded louder than it should have. I found it under the couch, she said, her voice steady only because she forced it to be. It was recording. Thomas didn't touch it immediately. He studied her instead, as if weighing something invisible, as if deciding whether she was a problem or something else. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached forward, picked up the recorder and turned it in his hand. "Did you listen to it?" he asked. Catherine hesitated. This was the last moment she could lie. The last moment she could retreat into safety. But she had already crossed that line the second she pressed play. "Yes." Another silence. Then, calmly, "How much did you hear?" "All of it." That did it. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not shock. Not anger. But something colder. Something that confirmed the truth had already been sitting in the back of his mind. He pressed play. Victor Salazar's voice filled the room. Low. Measured. Deadly. Catherine didn't move. She didn't speak. She watched. Because this moment mattered more than anything else. This was the moment that would decide if she lived or disappeared. Thomas Morty listened without interruption. Not a flicker. Not a breath out of place. Victor spoke about the timing. The poison. The money. The betrayal. The names. Each word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. And Thomas sat there. Completely still. As if he were listening to something distant. As if it had nothing to do with him. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. He placed the recorder back on the desk. Carefully. Deliberately. Then looked at Catherine. "You understood what you were hearing?" Again, not a question. A statement. Catherine nodded. "Yes." "You understood what would happen if you told me?" "Yes." "And you came anyway?" She swallowed. "Yes." He leaned back slightly, studying her again. Why? There were 1,000 answers she could have given. Morality. Justice. Right and wrong. But none of those felt honest enough. So, she said the only thing that was true. "I didn't want to be the reason someone died." Another silence. Longer this time. He looked at her as if he hadn't expected that answer. As if in a world built on calculation, she had just introduced something inconveniently human. Then he stood. Catherine instinctively straightened. He walked past her, slow and controlled, until he reached the window overlooking the city. Lights stretched endlessly below. A kingdom. His kingdom. And somewhere inside it, men were already preparing for his death. "I suspected him," Thomas said, almost to himself. Catherine didn't speak. "Money has been moving," he continued. "Information leaking. Small fractures in places that don't fracture by accident." He turned slightly, his gaze cutting back toward her. "But suspicion," he said, "is not proof." His eyes dropped briefly to the recorder. "This is proof." Catherine felt her shoulders loosen just slightly. He believed her. Not completely. Not blindly. But enough. Enough that she wasn't dead. Yet. "Do you know who placed it?" he asked. "No." "Think carefully." "I didn't see anyone," she said. "It was already there when I found it." He studied her face again. Searching for hesitation. For deception. He found none. Finally, he nodded once. "Then someone else in my house knows," he said quietly. The words carried weight. Danger. Implication. Catherine hadn't thought of that. She had only been focused on the voice. The plan. The immediate threat. But now she understood. There was another player. Someone inside. Someone watching. Someone who had been too afraid to come forward. But brave enough to leave evidence. Thomas returned to the desk. He picked up the recorder again, turning it once more between his fingers. "Saturday," he said. 11:30. Catherine's chest tightened. He looked at her. "I'm going to let it happen." The words hit her like a shock. "What?" His tone didn't change. "I'm going to let him make his move." She stopped herself, then forced the words out anyway. "That's dangerous." "Yes. He could." "He won't," Thomas said. Not arrogantly. Not dismissively. with certainty. I need him exposed, he continued. Not suspected, not removed quietly. Exposed. His gaze sharpened. In my world, betrayal isn't punished with silence. It's punished with clarity. Catherine understood. This wasn't just about survival. It was about control. About making sure no one else tried the same thing. But the poison? I won't drink it. His voice was calm. Absolute. There will be witnesses, cameras, timing. Every piece of his plan will unfold exactly as he expects. He stepped closer to her. And then it will break. Catherine held his gaze. For the first time, she saw not just power, but strategy. Precision. Kind of mind that didn't react. It calculated. Adjusted. 1. What about me? She asked. He didn't hesitate. You go back to work. Her stomach dropped. You act like nothing happened. And if he suspects? A pause. Then you leave. Leave? Immediately, he said. You don't go home. You don't go to anyone you know. You disappear. His eyes held hers. And I'll find you. The words weren't comforting. They weren't threatening either. They were something in between. A promise without warmth. A guarantee without softness. Catherine nodded slowly. I understand. Good. He turned away slightly, already shifting into action. 3 days, he said. That's all this takes. 3 days. 72 hours. To pretend. To survive. And in the same room as a man planning murder. And smile. Catherine turned to leave. But before she reached the door. Catherine. She stopped. That was the first time he had said her name. She turned back. He was watching her again. You had a choice tonight, he said. She didn't answer. You chose to speak. A pause. Then, quieter. That matters. She didn't know what to say to that. So she simply nodded once. Then left. The hallway felt different now. Colder. Longer. Heavier. As if the building itself knew something had changed. Catherine walked back toward the staff area, her steps steady only because she forced them to be. Every shadow looked sharper. Every sound felt louder. Every face she passed seemed suddenly suspicious. Who planted the recorder? Who else knew? And most importantly, who else was pretending? She turned the corner. And stopped. Victor Salazar stood near the bar. Alone. A glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up. Saw her. And smiled. Warm. Polite. Exactly the same as always. Catherine, he said, still working this late? Her heart slammed against her ribs. She forced a small smile. Yes, sir. You should take care of yourself, he said gently. You look tired. His eyes lingered on her for just a second too long. Get some rest when you can. I will. He nodded. Took a sip. Then turned away. As if nothing in the world had changed. As if he hadn't just calmly described a murder less than an hour ago. Catherine walked past him. Every instinct in her body screaming. But she didn't run. She didn't look back. Because now, she understood something very clearly. The most dangerous people in the world didn't look dangerous. They looked kind. That night, Catherine didn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling, replaying everything again and again. The voice. The plan. Thomas's eyes. 3 days. 3 days to walk through fire without burning. Her phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. She opened it. Payment overdue. Surgery cannot be scheduled without deposit confirmation. Her chest tightened. Illy. Everything came back to him. Every choice. Every risk. Every consequence. If she lost this job. If something went wrong. If Thomas decided she was expendable. Illy would lose everything. She closed her eyes. Took a slow breath. Then whispered into the darkness. Just 3 days. The next night, the velvet room was alive again. Music. Laughter. Money. Illusion. And Catherine moved through it like she always had. Tray in hand. Smile in place. Invisible. But inside, everything had changed. Because now she knew the truth. And truth, once seen, never lets you go. By the following evening, Catherine had learned that fear could become a rhythm. Not panic. Not screaming. Not the dramatic kind of terror people imagined in films. Something quieter. More efficient. A constant awareness beneath the skin. A sharpened state. A pulse that never fully slowed. That was what she carried into the velvet room on Thursday night. The club shimmered the way it always did, soft amber lighting, polished black marble, velvet booths, the scent of old money and newer sins. Men laughed too loudly. Women smiled too carefully. Crystal glasses touched in quiet toasts over conversations no ordinary person was ever meant to hear. And Catherine moved through all of it with a tray balanced on one hand and a secret heavy enough to crush her if she let it. No one looking at her would have guessed anything was wrong. That was her gift. She had spent years becoming unreadable in the ways poor women often did, not because life had made her cold, but because it had taught her the cost of letting the world see too much. Smile. Nod. Serve. Disappear. She was refilling a table near the piano when she felt it. That sensation. The unmistakable awareness of being watched. She looked up. Victor Salazar was standing across the room. His silver-streaked hair was combed neatly back. His charcoal suit fit him like old money. One hand rested lightly in his trouser pocket, the other around a low-ball glass of whiskey. And he was looking directly at her. Not casually. Not accidentally. Directly. Then, as if he had sensed her noticing, he smiled. A soft, paternal smile. Kind that made other people trust him. The kind Catherine now knew belonged to predators. He crossed the room at an unhurried pace. Every instinct in her body told her to leave. Instead, she stood still. Because fear, she was learning, had to be managed in inches. "Catherine," he said warmly as he approached. "You're on tonight." "Yes, sir." He glanced at the tray in her hand, then back at her face. "You really do work harder than most people here." "Thank you." "That wasn't flattery," he said lightly. "Just observation." He tilted his head, studying her with what looked to anyone else like gentle concern. "You seem distracted." Her grip tightened on the tray. "I'm fine." He took a slow sip of his drink. Then, in the same mild tone, asked, "How is your brother?" For one terrifying second, Catherine forgot how to breathe. The room around her did not change. Music still drifted from the piano. Guests still laughed. Glass still clinked. And yet, in that one question, everything sharpened into threat. She had never told him about Ali. Never told anyone here. Not by name. Not in detail. No one at the club should have known. Still, Catherine forced her face not to change. "He's okay." Victor nodded as though pleased. "I'm glad to hear it." He leaned one elbow lightly against the bar behind her, lowering his voice just enough to make the conversation feel intimate. "Sick children are expensive." Catherine said nothing. "Medical systems are cruel that way," he continued. "They ask ordinary people to perform miracles with ordinary salaries." His eyes held hers. "I imagine that must be stressful." There it was. Not a threat spoken plainly. Something more refined. More dangerous. The reminder that he knew where her life was soft. Where it could be pressed. Where it could break. Catherine kept her voice even. "Why are you asking me this, Mr. Salazar?" His smile deepened just slightly. "Because I care about the people who work for us." That almost made her laugh. Almost. Instead she said, "That's kind." Victor's gaze stayed on her a second longer. Then he set his glass down on her tray. "It's not kindness," he said. "It's efficiency. Happy employees make fewer mistakes." A beat. "And mistakes," he added softly, "can become very expensive." Then he walked away. Just like that. Leaving her standing there with a tray in her hand and cold moving through her bones. Later that night, Catherine found herself in the staff hallway behind the kitchen, pressing one hand against the cinder block wall and forcing herself to breathe. Not because she was weak. Because she was trying very hard not to unravel in public. He knows something. Not everything. But something. And if Victor Salazar was beginning to circle, then the next 48 hours would be far more dangerous than Thomas had let on. A door opened nearby. Catherine straightened instantly. It was Elena Ward, the floor manager. 34. Precise. Elegant in the severe way some women became after spending years in rooms where men underestimated them, Elena ran the club's front operations with the efficiency of a military officer and the silence of someone who knew too much. She looked at Catherine once. Then, at the wall. Then back at Catherine's face. "You should sit down for 5 minutes," Elena said quietly. "I'm fine." That wasn't a suggestion. Catherine blinked. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice. "He's testing you." Catherine went still. For a second, she wondered if she had imagined hearing it. "What?" Elena's expression didn't change. "Victor." The name landed between them like a blade laid flat on a table. Catherine stared at her. Elena held her gaze. Then said the one thing that made Catherine's blood turn cold. "I know about the recorder." Silence. No movement. No sound except the distant thrum of music from the main floor. Catherine's mind went blank. Then full. Then dangerous. She should deny it. She should walk away. She should say nothing. But Elena was already watching her the way only someone with real information watched, calmly, patiently, without bluff. "You." Catherine's voice came out thinner than she intended. "You put it there." Elena gave one small nod. Catherine stared at her. The woman who managed reservations, corrected uniforms, and never once raised her voice above polite professionalism, had planted evidence beneath the couch of one of the most dangerous men in the city. "Why?" Catherine whispered. For the first time, something flickered behind Elena's controlled expression. Not fear. Not shame. Something older. Something tired. "Because 3 years ago," Elena said, "I found discrepancies in the private account ledgers." Catherine's attention sharpened instantly. Numbers. Accounts. Movement. This, she understood. Elena continued. "At first I thought it was clerical error, then I thought it was laundering outside approved channels, then I realized Victor had built a parallel system." Catherine frowned. "What kind of system?" Elena's jaw tightened. "One designed to survive Thomas." That sent a chill through Catherine she couldn't explain. Not because the words were shocking, but because they made perfect sense. A succession structure. Layered. Quiet. Financial. Exactly the kind of thing Catherine herself would have mapped if she were trying to dismantle power without open war. Victor wasn't just planning a murder. He had been building a replacement architecture. Money. Loyalty. Information channels. Legal cover. An invisible skeleton waiting for the body at the top to die. "He threatened you," Catherine said softly. Elena gave a humorless smile. "That's one word for it." Catherine said nothing. Elena looked down the empty corridor once, making sure they were alone, then back at her. "He knew I'd seen enough to become inconvenient," she said. "Not enough to expose him, just enough to be dangerous. So why not go to Thomas?" At that, Elena's eyes changed. Not with fear. With something more bitter. Because powerful men don't always hear the truth from women who clean up after them. The words landed hard. Harder because they were true. Catherine thought of herself. Of trays. Of uniforms. Of invisibility mistaken for irrelevance. Elena continued, quieter now. "I didn't know if Thomas would believe me, and if he didn't," she paused, "then Victor would know exactly who spoke." Catherine understood. Because that had been her fear too. Elena looked at her directly. "So I did the only thing I could do. I planted the recorder and prayed someone else would find the courage I didn't have." Catherine let out a slow breath. Not relief. Something stranger. Recognition. 2 women in the same machine. Different floors. Same silence. "And now?" Catherine asked. Elena's voice went flat. "Now Victor is accelerating." "How do you know?" "Because Bianca has been meeting privately with legal counsel." Catherine's chest tightened. "Bianca Morty?" Elena nodded. 3 times this week. 2 trust attorneys. 1 private estate specialist. No wedding paperwork. No prenup revisions. Death structuring. That made Catherine's accounting mind lock into place. Trust amendments. Asset movement. Emergency authority. You could see it all now. Not just the murder. The aftermath. The way everything would move if Thomas died unexpectedly. Bianca would become the grieving fiancé. Victor would become the stabilizing advisor. The board would temporarily consolidate around existing internal leadership. and whatever illegal transfer structures had already been built would activate under cover of morning. It was elegant. Disgustingly elegant. Jesus, Catherine whispered. Yes, Elena said softly. That's about the right response. They stood in silence for a beat. Then Elena asked, Did Thomas believe you? Catherine hesitated. Then nodded. Yes. Something like relief passed over Elena's face, though it vanished almost immediately. Good, she said. Then maybe this ends. No, Catherine said quietly. I don't think it ends. I think it begins. Elena looked at her differently after that. More carefully. As if reassessing what kind of woman stood in front of her. Not just a waitress. Not just a witness. Something sharper. Something useful. What did you study before this place swallowed you? Elena asked. Catherine blinked. What? You don't think like service staff. The words weren't cruel. They were clinical. True. Catherine looked away. Forensic accounting. Elena stared. Seriously? I didn't finish. That doesn't mean you forgot. No, she hadn't forgotten. Numbers never really left you once you learned how to hear what they said in silence. Elena leaned in slightly. Then listened carefully. Victor built this the way I think he did. The poison is only one layer. Catherine's eyes snapped back to hers. What do you mean? I mean if Thomas survives Saturday, Victor may still have a contingency. That changed everything. Because murder wasn't just an event. It was a window. If he lost the clean kill, he might trigger the financial collapse anyway. Or frame someone. Or move funds beyond recovery. Or ignite a war Thomas couldn't stop in time. Catherine's stomach turned. We need to tell him. Elena gave her a long look. You think I don't know that? Then why are you telling me? That was when Elena said the thing Catherine wouldn't forget for a very long time. Because he'll hear it faster if it comes from the waitress who already saved his life once. The words landed in Catherine's chest and stayed there. Not because they were flattering. Because they were infuriatingly accurate. Power listened differently once it had been interrupted by truth. And Thomas Morty, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, had listened to her. Not because she was important. But because she had spoken without agenda. Without greed. Without asking for anything. That gave her a kind of credibility men in polished offices rarely understood until it was too late. Catherine straightened. How do I get to him without Victor seeing? Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a slim black keycard. She placed it in Catherine's hand. Private elevator. Service corridor B. Top floor. Use it after close. Catherine looked down at the card. Then back up. You're trusting me. Elena's expression was almost unreadable. No, she said. I'm trusting the fact that if you wanted to save yourself, you would have stayed silent on Wednesday. That was fair. Maybe the highest compliment one invisible woman could offer another. Then, Elena stepped back. And Catherine? Yes? If this goes wrong, Elena's voice softened just slightly. Don't let them turn your brother into the price of your conscience. Catherine looked at her for a long second. Then nodded. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she had not expected to find in a place like this. Not safety. Not friendship. But alliance. At 11:40 that night, after the last guests had drifted out and the jazz had finally gone silent, Catherine stood alone in service corridor B with Elena's keycard in one hand and her heart trying to break through her ribs. She swiped. The private elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. As the door slid shut, she looked at her own reflection in the brushed steel. Black uniform. Tired eyes. Shoulders tighter than they should have been. A woman no one would ever mistake for powerful. And yet, somehow, she was carrying a warning that could change the shape of an empire. The elevator began to rise. And Catherine Bell, waitress, bill collector, older sister, unfinished accountant, went upstairs to tell the Mafia boss that surviving poison might not be enough. The private elevator opened into silence. Not club silence. Not the muffled quiet of expensive walls holding in dangerous conversations. A different kind. Kind that existed in places where power lived without witnesses. Catherine stepped into a wide upper-floor corridor lined with dark walnut paneling and abstract art that probably cost more than her apartment building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and the skyline glittered below like something unreal beautiful from a distance, indifferent up close. She had never been on this level before. Employees weren't allowed here. Girls who carried trays definitely weren't. But the moment she stepped forward, she understood something almost absurdly clear. This was not the world built for women like her. Which was exactly why men like Thomas Morty kept surviving inside it. A security door ahead clicked open before she reached it. One of Thomas's guards stood there broad-shouldered and expressionless, already waiting. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why she was there. He simply said, "This way." Catherine followed him down the hall. At the far end was the same office she had entered the night before. The guard opened the door. She stepped inside. Thomas Morty was not behind the desk this time. He was standing by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tumbler with 2 melting cubes of ice and what looked like untouched bourbon. He had loosened his tie, removed his jacket, and rolled his sleeves once again, as though violence and exhaustion had become part of his dress code. He turned when she entered. His eyes moved over her face once quickly, efficiently. Assessing. Noticing. "You came back," he said. There was no surprise in his tone. Just observation. Catherine shut the door behind her. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." Something in his expression shifted barely. "Then say it." No preamble. No false softness. Just directness. That, Catherine found, was one of the few things she respected about him. So, she gave him the truth exactly as she had it. Elena Ward planted the recorder. Thomas's gaze sharpened instantly. "She told you this?" "Yes." He set the glass down on the edge of a side table and stepped away from the window. "She also told me Victor's been building something underneath you." The room changed. Not visibly. But Catherine felt it. The atmosphere tightened. Thomas came to a stop in front of her. "Explain." And so she did. She told him about the ledgers. The hidden structuring. The financial scaffolding Victor had apparently been constructing for years. She explained it the way she saw it, cleanly, analytically, almost forgetting for a moment where she was, or who she was speaking to. "This isn't just about killing you," she said. "It's about making your death administratively survivable." Thomas said nothing. So she kept going. "If Victor planned this properly, then the murder is only the visible part. The invisible part is what happens after. If you die, assets don't just move emotionally. They move legally, operationally, structurally. He's built a transition model." Thomas's eyes never left her face. Catherine took another breath. "Bianca's legal meetings confirm it." That landed. A flicker. Tiny. "But there." "You're certain?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'm not certain, but I'm trained enough to know what it looks like when someone prepares for controlled collapse." He was silent for a moment. Then, "What did you study?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated. Then answered honestly. "Forensic accounting." He looked at her for a beat too long. "As in financial crimes?" "Yes." "You didn't mention that." "You didn't ask." And there it was. The first spark. Not flirtation. Not warmth. Something more interesting. A collision. His mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. Then, it vanished. "How far did you get?" "3 years." "What happened?" Catherine looked away. The answer was too familiar, too plain, too humiliating in the way poverty often was. Life happened. He didn't push. That oddly made her trust him slightly more than if he had. Thomas walked back to the desk and leaned both hands against it. "So tell me," he said, "if you were trying to remove me without triggering open war, what would you have built?" Catherine blinked. "What?" His tone remained calm. "You heard me. You're asking me to think like the man trying to kill you." "I'm asking you," he said, "because you already are." The truth of that irritated her. Because he was right. She had been mapping it since the moment Elena mentioned ledgers. That was how her mind worked. Not because she enjoyed danger, because systems always revealed themselves if you stared long enough. Catherine exhaled slowly. Then stepped closer to the desk. "Fine." She looked down at the letter blotter at the clean lines of his office and began building the architecture aloud. "If Victor's smart, he has at least 3 redundancies." Thomas didn't interrupt. "1," she said, "liquidity transfer. If your death triggers panic, he'll need capital already parked in secondary channels. Offshore. Layered. Hard to freeze." Thomas nodded once. 2. Operational loyalty. Not your top men, middle infrastructure. Accountants, schedulers, legal handlers, people who make systems function but don't look important. A pause. People everyone ignores, Thomas said quietly. Catherine looked up at him. Yes. Something in that answer stayed between them for a second. Because both of them knew exactly what she meant. Invisible people ran the world. The difference was that men like Thomas had built empires by learning to see them. And men like Victor had built betrayals by assuming no one else would. And 3? Thomas asked. Public narrative. He went still. If you die suddenly, Catherine said, the first person who controls the story controls the first 48 hours. That's everything. If Bianca is involved, she becomes the grieving face. Victor becomes the stabilizing voice. Anyone who questions either of them looks opportunistic or disloyal. Thomas said nothing. But now she had his full attention. Not because she was a waitress. Not because she had found the recorder. Because she was useful in a way he had not expected. That was the first dangerous shift between them. Not attraction. Recognition. He looked at her for a long moment. Then said quietly, "Sit down." Catherine didn't move. "I'm fine." That wasn't a request. Her jaw tightened. "I know how commands work." A silence. Then, unexpectedly, Thomas pulled out the chair across from the desk himself. And waited. It was a small thing. A nearly meaningless thing. But in a world where men like him were obeyed without thought, the gesture landed with surprising force. Not because it was kind. Because it acknowledged her as someone participating in the room, not merely standing in it. Catherine sat. He took the seat opposite her. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a boss interrogating an employee. It felt like a war room. "You think there's a secondary trigger?" he asked. "Yes." "What kind?" "I don't know yet." "That's not useful." "No," Catherine said evenly, "it's honest." Again that almost smile. Brief. Dangerous. Then gone. Thomas folded his hands. "What do you want?" The question came out so suddenly she frowned. "What?" "You didn't come back here tonight for free." Her face hardened instantly. He saw it. And understood his mistake half a second too late. "I didn't mean." "Yes, you did." His jaw shifted. Catherine leaned back in the chair. "This is the part where powerful men ruin the only decent instinct they've had all week," she said quietly. Thomas's gaze narrowed not in anger but in attention. "You think I'm here for money?" "I think everyone is here for something." "That's convenient," she said. "It means you never have to believe in principle." The words hung in the room. Sharp. Risky. True. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Then Thomas said, more carefully this time, "If I'm going to pull you into this, I need to know where the line is." That changed it. Not an insult. A correction. A serious question. Catherine held his gaze. Then answered. "You want my help?" "Yes." "Then I have conditions." He didn't laugh. Didn't dismiss her. Didn't remind her who she was and who he was. He simply said, "Go on." And Catherine Bell, waitress, debt collector, exhausted older sis, gave the Mafia boss rules. "First," she said, "nobody gets hurt if they're not part of this." His expression didn't change. "Meaning?" "Staff, bartenders, servers, drivers, assistants. If they're not knowingly involved, they stay out of whatever happens Saturday." Thomas nodded once. "Done." "Second," she continued, "Elena is protected." A pause. Then, "Agreed." "Fully." I said agreed. Catherine didn't look away. "Third." His brows lifted slightly. "There's more?" "Yes." And for the first time that night, she let him see exactly how serious she was. "If I help you stop this, you do not make me part of whatever revenge comes after." Thomas leaned back slightly. "Revenge? That's what men like you call justice when you're angry." His eyes stayed on hers. "And, if I disagree? Then find someone else." The room went very still. Because now they had arrived at the real edge of things. This was the moment when he could remind her that no one spoke to him this way. This was the moment when power usually reasserted itself. Instead, Thomas Morty looked at her for a long, unreadable beat. And said, "All right." Catherine blinked. "What?" "You said you had conditions." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm accepting them." Something in her chest shifted unexpectedly. Not because he agreed. Because he did it without humiliation. Without making her earn the right to ask. That was rarer than men like him understood. He continued. You help me identify the secondary structure. We stop what's coming on Saturday. Alina walks. Staff stay untouched. A pause. And when it's over, you walk away if that's what you choose. That last part mattered more than either of them said aloud. Because choice, real choice, was the one thing power hated giving. Catherine nodded slowly. All right. Thomas stood. Then moved to a locked side cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. He placed it on the desk in front of her. Start here. Catherine looked down. Internal reports. Vendor summaries. Expense anomalies. Private event routing. Limited financials. Not everything. But enough. He looked back up. You're serious? I don't joke about survival. There. She opened the file. And instantly, despite herself, despite exhaustion, despite danger, her brain lit up. Patterns. Numbers. Timing. There it was. The old part of her. The part she had buried beneath rent and uniforms and grief. Alive again. Useful again. She began scanning pages. At first quietly. Then with growing focus. Thomas watched her for a while without speaking. And Catherine forgot, for a few dangerous minutes, that she was in a Mafia boss's office after midnight. Because systems were systems. Fraud was fraud. Lies were always lazy somewhere if you knew where to look. 20 minutes later, she froze on one line item. Then another. Then 3 more. What? Thomas asked. She looked up slowly. He's using event vendors. Thomas frowned. What? He's not hiding everything in major accounts. That would get flagged. He's slicing movement through small recurring service channels, linen contracts, private liquor procurement, floral billing, temporary transport invoices. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages. Small enough to look boring, consistent enough to disappear, but layered together? She tapped the folder. It's not theft. Thomas went still. It's routing. A beat. Then he understood. Movement infrastructure. Yes. Not just money. Capability. Vehicles. Access. Unquestioned deliveries. People and materials moving in and out under the cover of ordinary operations. The club itself had become a corridor. Thomas's face changed. Not dramatically. But enough. The calm surface remained. Underneath it, something colder arrived. Can you trace it? Catherine hesitated. With enough time, yes. You have until Saturday. That made her laugh once dry, exhausted, disbelieving. Yes, I do. And to her surprise, Thomas almost laughed too. Almost. Instead he said, You'll work from here tomorrow. Catherine looked up sharply. No. His expression hardened. No? No. Why? Because if Victor sees me suddenly vanish from the floor, he'll know something changed. Thomas considered that. Then nodded once. Annoyingly, infuriatingly, he nodded like a man who respected competence when it contradicted him. Fine, he said. Then you work both. Catherine stared. You're kidding. I don't joke about survival, he repeated. She exhaled hard and dropped her head briefly into one hand. For one small second, she heard him say, quieter now. You look exhausted. She glanced up. And for the first time, there was no calculation in his face. Just observation. Human. Brief but real. Yeah, she said. His voice lowered slightly. When this is over, your brother gets what he needs. Catherine's spine went rigid. No. He looked surprised. No? You don't get to buy me in advance. His expression changed again, this time not with irritation, but something almost like respect. That wasn't what I was doing. That's exactly what powerful men think when they call it help. He held her gaze. Then said quietly and without offense. Noted. And somehow that one word landed harder than any argument could have. Noted. Not challenged. Not overruled. Just heard. Catherine looked down at the file again. And for the first time in years, she felt something both dangerous and impossible. Not trust. Not yet. but the beginning of the kind of respect that could become trust if both people survived long enough. Outside the windows, the city glittered below them. Inside the office, a waitress and a king sat over stolen numbers and hidden betrayal. And somewhere beneath the club, beneath the money, beneath the silk and whiskey and lies, Saturday was already waiting. Saturday arrived like a held breath. All day the city had felt wrong to Catherine. Not visibly. Nothing dramatic. No sirens, no storm, no cinematic omen hanging over the skyline. Just a pressure in the air. A strange, quiet certainty that by midnight, several lives would no longer belong to the people currently living them. She spent the afternoon at her apartment table with photocopied vendor sheets, handwritten notes, and the kind of cheap black coffee that tasted like survival instead of comfort. She had slept maybe 2 hours. Maybe less. Her eyes burned. Her shoulders ached. But her mind remained sharp in that exhausted, dangerous way it sometimes did when she was too tired to waste energy on fear. She had found more. Not enough to expose the full machine, but enough to confirm what she and Thomas already suspected. Victor hadn't built a murder. He had built a replacement system. Routine transport invoices that doubled as unlogged movement channels. 2 shell event companies with mirrored addresses. A security subcontractor whose staffing lists overlapped with private funeral service transport. That one had chilled her. Because it meant he had prepared not only for Thomas's death, but for what came after the body. Catherine had called Elena once from a burner number Thomas's people had given her. Only once. Only long enough to say, "He has contingencies." Elena had answered with one sentence. "I know." Then hung up. By 7:30 that evening, Catherine stood in the employee locker room buttoning the black cuffs of her uniform shirt and staring at herself in the mirror. She looked pale. Not fragile. Just worn thin. A woman held together by obligation and adrenaline. She thought of Ali. He had called earlier from the hospital, his voice bright in that brave way children learned when they knew adults were scared. "Are you coming tomorrow?" he'd asked. Yes, she had told him. And she meant it. That was the only promise she allowed herself tonight. Not that everything would be okay. Not that justice would win. Only this. I will still be alive tomorrow. She tied her apron. Smoothed it flat. Then walked out onto the floor. The velvet room was already full. Saturday always brought the city's worst men dressed as its best. Politicians with discreet appetites. Developers with city contracts and no souls. Lawyers who billed by the hour and lied by instinct. And tonight, as if fate had chosen spectacle, the club was more crowded than usual. Music drifted low from the jazz trio in the corner. Crystal chandeliers cast warm gold over polished marble and velvet seating. Servers moved like shadows between tables. And at the center of it all, as though the entire building had unconsciously arranged itself around him, sat Thomas Morty. He wore a black suit, so precise it looked almost ceremonial. One hand rested lightly on the arm of his chair. The other held a low tumbler he had not yet touched. From across the room he looked exactly as he always did. Composed. Untouchable. Dangerous in the calmest possible way. No one watching him tonight would have guessed he already knew there was a plan to kill him before midnight. And no one watching Catherine would have guessed she knew it too. That was what made the room unbearable. Everyone else was innocent in the smallest, strangest sense. Not innocent morally. Not clean. But innocent of this exact moment. Only 3 people in the room truly understood what the night was becoming. Thomas. Victor. Catherine. And maybe Elena somewhere in the operational shadows. That was all. Catherine moved between tables with a tray balanced expertly in one hand, her eyes never stopping for long in any one place. Watch the exits. Watch the bar. Watch Victor. Watch Thomas. Watch Bianca. Especially Bianca. Bianca Morty arrived at 9:15 wearing white. Not bridal white. Not innocent white. Kind of white rich women wore when they wanted the room to make meaning out of them. Her dress was silk, her diamonds were obscene, her smile was flawless. And when she crossed the floor and leaned down to kiss Thomas on the cheek, Catherine saw him place one hand lightly at the small of her back in a gesture so natural, so intimate, so convincingly effortless, that even Catherine nearly forgot it might all be theater. Bianca said something that made several men at the table laugh. Thomas answered with what looked like easy amusement. Victor stood nearby, a half step behind and to the side, like he had for years. Faithful advisor. Trusted architect. The serpent in a tailored suit. He looked relaxed. That was the worst part. Not nervous. Not hurried. Relaxed. A man who believed the future already belonged to him. At 10 o'clock, Catherine crossed behind the main bar and glanced discreetly toward the mirrored liquor shelves. There it was. The bottle. Macallan 25. Thomas's end of night ritual. The same one Victor had described on the recorder. One final glass after the room emptied. One final quiet moment. A habit. A pattern. A weakness. Catherine kept moving. She refilled a table of city councilmen. Cleared empty glasses from a private booth. Delivered champagne to a woman who never looked directly at service staff. And all the while, she counted time in the back of her mind like a second heartbeat. 10, 15, 10, 28, 10, 40. The crowd began to thin. Not quickly. Not suspiciously. Just the ordinary drift of wealthy people deciding they had consumed enough of one another for the night. Coats were collected. Hands were shaken. Promises made. Phones checked. Cars called. One by one, the room loosened. At 10:50, Catherine saw Elena near the far hallway speaking quietly to a floor captain. Their eyes met for half a second. No signal. No expression. But Catherine knew. Everything was in motion now. She turned. And nearly walked directly into Victor. He smiled immediately, as if the near collision amused him. Careful, he said softly. You seem tense tonight. I'm just tired. He glanced toward the bar, then back to her. You know, Catherine, he said in that same gentle, conversational tone, I've always admired people who understand their place. Her grip tightened around the tray. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you are. He leaned slightly closer. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to turn the air colder. Loyalty is a simple thing, he said. Most people complicate it by talking. Then he stepped aside with a gracious little smile, as if he had merely been making room for her to pass. Catherine walked away without responding. But now there was no doubt left. He knew. Not everything. But enough. Enough to be dangerous. Enough that if tonight went wrong, she would not survive the mistake. By 11:10, the room had become intimate. Only Thomas's inner circle remained. A few senior men. One private invest. Bianca. Vict. And staff moving in controlled silence. Catherine was resetting a side table when she felt it. That strange instinctive pull of awareness. She looked up. Thomas was watching her. Not openly. Not in a way anyone else would notice. But directly enough that she understood the message immediately. Be ready. Catherine held his gaze for 1 second. Then blinked once. A small answer. Nothing more. And then the room moved again. At 11:20, Bianca stood. She kissed Thomas's cheek once more, slow and elegant, and murmured something near his ear. He answered quietly. She smiled. Then left. Catherine watched her go with a chill she couldn't explain. Not because Bianca looked guilty. Because she looked relieved. That was worse. Victor remained. Of course he remained. At 11:26, the last guest rose and drifted toward the exit under the soft guidance of security and staff. The jazz trio had long since packed up. The chandeliers dimmed one shade lower. The room emptied. And suddenly, just as the recorder had promised, the world narrowed. Thomas sat alone in the VIP lounge. Victor moved toward the bar. Catherine stood near the service station with a stack of folded linen napkins in her hands. And the air itself seemed to stop. Victor reached the bar with the same polished ease he brought to every room. The bartender, Tony, was finishing his side work. Victor smiled at him warmly. I've got this one. Tony nodded at once. No suspicion. Why would there be? Victor had probably poured Thomas's final drink 100 times before. Routine. That was the brilliance of it. Nothing about the murder required force. Only familiarity. Catherine watched from several meters away, pretending to sort linens while every nerve in her body strained toward the bar. Victor reached for the Macallan 25. Uncapped it. Poured 2 fingers into a crystal tumbler. Amber liquid caught the chandelier light and glowed like old fire. Then, his right hand slipped into the inside pocket of his jacket. Calm. Smooth. Invisible unless you were already looking. He drew out something so small Catherine nearly missed it. A transparent capsule. No larger than a vitamin. He tipped it into the whiskey. It vanished almost instantly. No color. No residue. No hesitation. Just a brief, soft drop. And then nothing. Victor gave the glass a light swirl. Once. Twice. As if rating the scent. As if honoring the quality of the liquor. As if he were not standing there carrying death in his hand. Catherine's mouth went dry. It was happening. Not in theory. Not in possibility. Not on a recording. Now. Real. Visible. Her body went cold and hot all at once. She knew Thomas had planned for this. Knew there were eyes on the room. Knew he had prepared. But something in her refused to trust any plan that still allowed poison to come this close. Victor turned. Walked toward Thomas. Each step measured. Unhurried. Confidence of a man who had already imagined the next chapter and was merely walking toward it. He reached the table and set the glass down with easy familiarity. One final pour, he said. Thomas looked up at him. His face gave away nothing. Not anger. Not knowledge. Not even caution. Just calm. Thank you, he said. Victor inclined his head slightly and stepped back. Then he waited. Catherine's pulse slammed. Thomas reached for the glass. Lifted it. The amber whiskey moved inside the crystal. The light caught the rim. And suddenly all Catherine could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. What if something fails? What if a bodyguard is half a second late? What if Thomas drinks before the trap closes? What if this is the part where clever men die because everyone trusted timing too much? Thomas raised the glass higher. Poured his mouth. Victor watched. The room held its breath. And Catherine, without thought, without permission, without strategy, moved. She grabbed the nearest silver serving tray. Turned sharply toward the table. And as she passed behind Thomas's chair, she let one foot catch hard against the leg of a side stool. Her body lurched forward. The tray tipped. And her arm slammed directly into Thomas's wrist. The crystal glass flew from his hand. It hit the marble floor. And shattered. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Whiskey exploded across polished stone. Amber and glass everywhere. The silence after was immediate. Violent. Absolute. Catherine dropped to her knees at once. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. Her voice came out breathless, panicked, perfectly believable. She reached instinctively toward the shards as if trying to clean the impossible. And in that bent, lowered position, she saw everything. Thomas had gone still. Not startled. Still. Victor had gone pale. Not angry. Pale. That was how she knew she had just destroyed something far larger than a drink. For 1 second, too long, Victor forgot to perform. And in that 1 second, his face became naked. Not gracious. Not paternal. Not polished. Cornered. Thomas looked down at the shattered whiskey. Then at Catherine kneeling beside it. Then, up at Victor. And when he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. No. Victor blinked. What? Thomas stood. Slowly. Deliberately. Every eye in the room turned toward him. No, Thomas repeated. I think, he said, that's enough for tonight. Victor recovered quickly. Too quickly. He forced a strained smile. It's only a drink. I'll pour another. Thomas's gaze didn't move. No. This time the word landed like a verdict. Victor's face changed. Only slightly. But enough. Enough for everyone in the room to feel it. Enough for the atmosphere to split open. He knew. Thomas knew. The performance was over. And suddenly, beneath the chandeliers and velvet and polished civility, the room became what it had always secretly been. A battlefield. Victor's right hand moved. Fast. Not toward the bar. Not toward another bottle. Inside his jacket. Catherine saw it first. Thomas saw it second. The bodyguard saw it at the same instant. A gun flashed black beneath the warm gold light. And then the room exploded. One guard slammed into Victor from the left. Another caught his wrist before the weapon fully cleared the holster. The gun discharged once. A deafening crack that shattered one of the mirrored back panels behind the bar. Women screamed somewhere in the distance. Security flooded the room. Victor was driven hard to the floor, his cheek striking marble, one arm twisted behind his back. The pistol skidded away across the stone. And suddenly the elegant old advisor was no longer elegant at all. He was red-faced. Snarling. Spitting fury through the broken remains of his composure. "You think this ends here?" he shouted, struggling against the guards. "You think you've won because you caught one hand?" Thomas did not move toward him immediately. He stood exactly where he was. Calm. Cold. Untouched. Then, after a beat too long, he stepped forward. The room fell even quieter somehow. Victor was breathing hard now, his face pressed sideways against the marble floor, both arms pinned. Thomas stopped in front of him. Looked down. And for the first time all night, Catherine saw something in his face that was almost worse than rage. Disappointment. 20 years, that look said. 20 years and this is what you were. Victor laughed once, wild, bitter, stripped of refinement. She was supposed to be nothing, he hissed, jerking his chin toward Catherine. A waitress. A nobody. And you let a nobody ruin you. Thomas's gaze shifted. Only briefly. Toward Catherine. She was still kneeling amid broken glass, one hand cut and bleeding where a shard had nicked her palm. Then he looked back down at Victor. And said the one sentence Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. "No," Thomas said quietly. "You ruined yourself the moment you mistook invisible people for powerless ones." Silence. Then Thomas gave the smallest nod. His men hauled Victor to his feet. He kept shouting. Threatening. Raging. Naming people. Naming institutions. Naming systems bigger than any one room. But no one answered him. No one needed to. He was dragged backward through the private corridor, and out of sight, his voice fading with every step until the room fell silent again. A real silence this time. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just the stunned emptiness that follows the collapse of something everyone thought was stable. Catherine remained on the floor for one extra second. Then two. Because her body had not yet caught up to the fact that she was still alive. That Thomas was still alive. That the poison sat harmlessly in shattered whiskey at her knees. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. Thomas stood in front of her, one hand extended. Palm open. Waiting. For a strange second, she simply stared at it. Not because she didn't understand the gesture. Because she did. And because something about it felt larger than standing up. She placed her hand in his. He pulled her carefully to her feet. His grip was warm. Steady. His eyes dropped to the blood on her palm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." He didn't answer that. Didn't let go immediately either. Then, quieter. "You weren't supposed to do that." Catherine gave a shaky breath that almost became a laugh. "You were about to drink it." "I wasn't." "You don't know that." His eyes held hers. For a moment the room around them disappeared. No guards. No blood. No shattered glass. No empire. Only two people standing in the aftermath of a choice neither of them could undo. Then he said, low enough that only she could hear. "You just saved my life twice." Catherine didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she always did when emotions got too large. She looked away. "I was protecting my shift," she said dryly. And to her complete shock, Thomas laughed. Not loudly. Not long. Just once. A real laugh. Brief and rough and startled out of him like he hadn't expected himself to still be capable of it. When she looked back at him, something in his face had changed. Not softened. That would have been too simple. But altered. As if he no longer saw her through the category he had originally assigned. Not waitress. Not witness. Not temporary inconvenience. Something else. Something that could no longer be put back where he'd first found it. One of his guards approached. "Boss." Thomas looked away from Catherine and back toward the corridor where Victor had been dragged. His expression hardened instantly. Business returned. "What about Bianca?" Catherine asked quietly. That got his attention immediately. He looked back at her. Then toward Elena, who had just appeared near the service corridor. The two exchanged a glance too fast for anyone else to notice. Thomas understood. Bianca had not left early out of disinterest. She had left to wait. to become whatever came next. The grieving woman. The legal widow, in all but name. The face of continuity. Thomas's jaw tightened once. Then he looked at Catherine and said, "It's not over." And she knew, from the way he said it, that tonight had only broken the first layer. The poison had failed. But the machine behind it was still alive. It was after midnight, and yet no one in the velvet room was leaving. Not really. Bodies moved. Orders were given. Glass was swept. Security shifted. Phones were taken. Doors were locked. But beneath the choreography of containment, the building itself felt awake in a new way, as if the walls had finally heard what had always been whispered inside them and could no longer pretend not to know. Victor Salazar had been removed. The poison plot had failed. Thomas Morty was alive. And still, as Catherine stood in the shattered remains of the VIP lounge with blood drying on her palm and whiskey still shining across the marble floor, she knew one thing with terrible clarity. This was not the end. Thomas turned from the corridor where Victor had disappeared and looked directly at Elena. "Conference room," he said. Elena nodded once. 10 minutes. Then he looked at Catherine. "You're coming." That should not have surprised her anymore. And yet, it did. Because less than 4 days ago, she had been an invisible waitress collecting glasses in a room full of men who would never remember her face. Now the man they all feared was speaking to her as if her presence at the center of this night were not only natural, but necessary. Catherine should have refused. She should have gone home. She should have walked out while she still could and let powerful people clean up the bloodless messes of other powerful people. But she looked down at the pool of poisoned whiskey on the floor, and knew she was already too far inside this to pretend innocence. So she nodded. "All right." 10 minutes later, Catherine sat at a long black conference table on the private floor with Elena on one side of her and Thomas at the head. 3 members of Thomas's inner security team stood near the walls. A lawyer Catherine had never seen before was already on a laptop. 2 phones lay in the center of the table. One belonged to Victor. The other had been recovered from the private vehicle Bianca had used to leave the club. Thomas stood instead of sitting. He seemed larger when he was angry, not louder, not more theatrical, just more exact. Every movement became cleaner, every silence sharper. "Report," he said. One of the security men answered first. Victor had a second phone on him. "Encrypted. We're in. There are message chains with 3 outside numbers and 1 internal legal contact." "Bianca?" Thomas asked. "We believe so." The lawyer spoke next. "Sir, if MS. Dale was preparing trust transition and emergency authority documents under assumption of incapacitation or death, there will be metadata trails. We're already proofing internal copies." Catherine blinked. Proofing. The kind of phrase only existed in rooms where people had enough money to commit crimes elegantly. Thomas's gaze moved to Elena. "Elena?" Elena slid a thin folder across the table. "Printed logs from hospitality scheduling and executive vendor movement for the past 6 weeks. I flagged the overlaps Catherine identified." Thomas looked at Catherine then. Not theatrically. Not with gratitude. Just with direct, unhidden acknowledgement. "Walk me through it." The room turned to her. Every instinct she had was still wired to shrink when too many important people looked her way. But something had changed in the last 72 hours. Maybe because she was tired. Maybe because fear had already reached its peak and burned itself out. Or maybe because once a woman had interrupted a murder in front of a room full of men, ordinary intimidation lost some of its effect. Catherine reached for the folder. Opened it. And began. Victor's structure wasn't just financial, she said, it was logistical. She laid out the patterns the way she saw them. The event vendors with impossible invoice repetition. The duplicated service routes. The small operational accounts used not for theft but for movement. He explained how shell entities functioned best when they looked boring. How no one ever questioned floral billing, linen supply, late night transport, or temporary labor if the top-level business already handled luxury events. It's camouflage, she said, not laundering in the obvious sense. A corridor, something designed to move people, cash, documents, maybe even control materials under legitimate noise. Thomas listened without interrupting. Elena watched her with quiet satisfaction. The lawyer was already taking notes. Catherine turned a page. "And if I'm right," she continued, "then Victor planned for 2 outcomes." Thomas's voice was low. "Which are? 1. You die and the structure activates under cover of morning. A beat. 2. If you survive, he destabilizes anyway. The room went still. Thomas's jaw shifted once. How? Catherine looked at the documents. By forcing a legitimacy crisis. The lawyer leaned forward. Explain. She nodded. If Victor can't inherit cleanly through your death, then the next best move is to make you look compromised enough that internal partners, outside allies, and legal handlers begin fracturing around you. Thomas folded his arms. Meaning? Meaning if Bianca goes public with the right story, and if Victor has enough documentation prepared, they can frame tonight as paranoia, internal abuse, unstable command, unlawful detention. Elena inhaled sharply. The lawyer swore under his breath. And Thomas went very still. Because now they all saw it. The second blade. If Thomas had Victor dragged away in silence and handled things the old way, Bianca and the legal structure behind her could still weaponize appearance. Victor becomes the victim. Thomas becomes the irrational tyrant. The organization fractures. External enemies move in. Police pressure shifts. Political allies retreat. Not because Thomas had done nothing wrong in truth, but because truth was not the same thing as narrative. And narrative, once launched publicly, was almost impossible to kill cleanly. Thomas looked at Catherine. What's the solution? She met his gaze. Don't bury this. Silence. A dangerous silence. Because in rooms like this, powerful men were accustomed to solving betrayal with disappearance. Catherine knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. He also knew something else. Buried truth rotted into future danger. So she held his gaze and said the hardest thing anyway. You expose it. No one moved. The lawyer spoke first. That's difficult. It's necessary, Catherine said. Thomas's eyes never left hers. Publicly? Yes. Do you understand what that would cost? Yes. And she did. Public exposure meant scrutiny. Audits. Questions. Maybe even weakness. But it also meant something Victor could never easily recover from. Irreversible daylight. You want this dead? Catherine asked quietly. Then kill the secrecy that feeds it. The room remained silent. Then, Elena said, very softly. She's right. The lawyer looked pained but nodded. Thomas turned away. Walked to the windows. Looked out over the city he had spent his life learning how to control. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then, without turning back, he said, Bring Bianca in. Bianca Vale arrived 2 minutes later in a cream wool coat over the same white silk dress she had worn earlier, as if she had expected to be summoned back into tragedy and wanted to look appropriate for it. She entered the conference room with visible annoyance first. Then caution. Then calculation. Her eyes moved quickly across the room. Thomas. Elena. Security. Lawyer. Catherine. For one small second, Bianca's gaze sharpened when it landed on Catherine. Not because she recognized her socially. Because she recognized the shape of disruption. That alone made Catherine dislike her more. Thomas, Bianca said, her voice smooth and offended in equal measure. What is the meaning of this? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He remained standing at the head of the table. Controlled. Unreadable. Then he said, Sit. Bianca gave a tiny laugh. No. Security shifted almost imperceptibly. Bianca noticed. So did Catherine. And suddenly the room became a different kind of dangerous. Not physical. Strategic. Bianca turned slightly, her expression hardening. If this is about Victor, I already heard there was some kind of incident downstairs, and frankly the optics alone are. Sit, Thomas repeated. This time his voice was so quiet it carried more threat than if he had shouted. Bianca sat. Not because she wanted to. Because she understood enough about power to know when she had misjudged the room. Thomas picked up Victor's phone. Tapped the screen once. Then slid it across the table to her. Open the message thread with your number. Bianca looked at the phone. Then at him. Then laughed again, but there was strain in it now. I have no idea what kind of performance this is, but I'm not indulging paranoia at 2 a.m. Thomas didn't blink. Elena. Elena tapped a button on the conference speaker. Victor's voice filled the room. Not the original recorder this time. A newer recording. Recovered from his own phone. Victor, calm and familiar, speaking directly to Bianca about timing, documents, post-event positioning, and how devastated you'll need to look. The sound of Bianca's own voice answering came next. Clear. Unmistakable. Measured in the same way all ambitious cruelty was measured. I can do devastated. No one in the room moved. Bianca's face drained. Not dramatically. Just enough. She recovered quickly, but not fully. That proves nothing. The lawyer spoke for the first time. Actually, it proves conspiracy. Bianca snapped her gaze toward him. You work for him. I work for liability, the lawyer said flatly. Tonight, you became one. Catherine watched Bianca carefully. And in that moment, she understood something important. Victor had been the architect. But Bianca had been the vanity structure around him. Not the brains. Not the logistics. The face. The legitimacy. The polished story people would find easier to believe than the uglier truth. And suddenly Catherine understood exactly how to break her. Not with fear. With exposure. She leaned forward. Everyone looked at her. Including Bianca. And Catherine asked, very quietly. Did you ever love him at all? Bianca blinked. What? Thomas, Catherine said. Did you ever love him? Thomas turned his head slightly. Not because he needed the answer. Because he wanted to hear how she would lie. Bianca's expression changed. Then sharpened into contempt. And that was the mistake. Because contempt always told the truth faster than confession. This is absurd, Bianca said coldly. I'm not going to justify my private life to waitstaff. Catherine didn't flinch. Of course not, she said, because if you answer honestly, the room stops seeing you as elegant and starts seeing you as ordinary. Bianca's jaw tightened. Catherine continued, calm and relentless now. You weren't building a future. You were curating access. Thomas was a position to you, a surname, a gate. Victor offered you continuity with less inconvenience. Bianca stood abruptly. You have no right to speak to me. No, Catherine said, standing too. You just got caught by someone you trained yourself not to notice. The room went silent. Not because Catherine had raised her voice. Because she hadn't. Because truth spoken quietly in the right room was often more violent than shouting. Bianca looked at Thomas. Not with love. Not with apology. With fury. And there it was. Her real face. Not glamorous. Not tragic. Small. Hungry. Humiliated. Thomas watched her for a long second. Then said with terrible calm. You're finished. That was it. No theatrics. No speech. No vengeance performed for ego. Just judgment. Bianca looked at him as if she had finally, truly understood that there was no recovering this. Then she looked at Catherine. And if hatred had weight, it would have knocked her backward. But Catherine did not look away. Because some women spent their whole lives being trained to shrink in the face of expensive contempt. And tonight, she was done. Security escorted Bianca out. She didn't scream. Didn't plead. Didn't confess. She simply left in the brittle silence of a woman whose future had just collapsed under the weight of her own ambition. And when the door shut behind her, the room exhaled. It was nearly 4 a.m. when the final decisions were made. Thomas did what men like him almost never did willingly. He chose exposure over convenience. Lawyers were mobilized. Internal records preserved. 2 outside financial crime consultants were retained before dawn. A private statement was drafted for key partners. Victor's contingency channels were frozen. Bianca's trust filings were intercepted and neutralized. And most importantly, Thomas gave orders that no one outside the actual conspiracy would be touched. No random disappearances. No cleanups. No punishing of low-level staff for failing to notice what had been built above them. Catherine noticed Elena hearing that order. And the look on Elena's face was small but unmistakable. Relief. Real relief. When the conference room finally emptied, only Catherine and Thomas remained. For the first time in hours, the building was quiet. No music. No shouting. No phones ringing. Just the faint hum of climate control, and the city still dark beyond the windows. Catherine stood slowly from her chair. Her whole body felt made of old wire and borrowed strength. It's over, she said. Thomas looked at her. No, he said, but it's honest now. That was, she realized, probably the closest thing a man like him ever came to hope. She nodded once, then reached for her apron folded over the back of the chair. I should go. He was silent for a second. Then, Catherine. She looked up. Thomas stepped closer. Not enough to crowd her. Just enough to make the moment impossible to misunderstand. When I said your brother would get what he needs. She tensed slightly. He noticed. And this time he spoke before she could object. I know what you're going to say. She crossed her arms. Do you? Yes. His expression remained steady. You're going to tell me you're not for sale? A beat. And you're right. That stopped her. He continued. So I'm not offering payment for loyalty. His voice dropped lower. I'm offering a choice. That word. Again. Choice. The only thing that mattered. Thomas held her gaze. Lily's surgery gets paid for, quietly, legally, through a foundation that has no tie to me on paper if that makes it easier for your conscience. Catherine said nothing. You can refuse, he said, and I'll respect that. He paused. But don't refuse because you think suffering makes you morally pure. The words hit harder than she expected. Not because they were cruel. Because they were true. Too many people who had survived hardship learned to distrust relief. Think accepting help made them weak. But compromised. As if pain had somehow become part of their identity. Thomas's gaze softened, not romantically, not yet, just humanly. Let your brother live, he said quietly. You don't owe poverty your loyalty. And Catherine Bell, who had held herself together through grief, debt, exhaustion, fear, and pride, felt her eyes sting before she could stop them. She looked away immediately, annoyed with herself. He did not mention the tears. Did not step closer. Did not turn the moment into something it wasn't. He simply waited. And that, more than anything else, undid her. She took one breath. Then another. Then nodded. Yes, she whispered. It was the smallest word in the world. And one of the hardest she had ever said. Thomas gave a single nod back. No triumph. No ownership. Only understanding. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed a business card on the table between them. Not a personal card. A corporate one. Legitimate. Clean. She looked at it. Morty Holdings, Financial, Operations Division. Then looked back up at him. He said, You're wasted carrying whiskey. Despite everything, despite the hour, despite the emotional wreckage of the night. Catherine laughed. Softly. Tiredly. For real. And Thomas, watching her, looked almost startled by the sound. There's a position, he said. Real salary. Real authority. Legal side only. You can say no. She picked up the card. Turned it once between her fingers. Then looked at him and asked the only question that mattered. If I say no, do I still get to leave? Thomas answered immediately. Yes. That was the right answer. Maybe the only one. Catherine nodded once. Then I'll think about it. For some reason that seemed to please him more than if she had accepted on the spot. Good, he said. A pause. Then, very quietly. Take your time. 3 weeks later. St. Agnes Cardiac Center smelled like antiseptic, vending machine coffee, and exhausted hope. Catherine sat beside Ellie's hospital bed with a paperback in her lap she hadn't turned a page of in 15 minutes. Her brother was asleep. His chest rose and fell steadily beneath the pale blue blanket. His surgery had been 3 days ago. And it had worked. Not promising. Not cautiously optimistic. Worked. The surgeon had said the phrase twice because Catherine had cried too hard to process it the first time. He's going to be okay. There were no words big enough for what that did to a person. No language wide enough for the relief of watching someone you loved survive the thing you had been quietly preparing to lose them to. The hospital room was quiet in the warm afternoon light. Ellie shifted in his sleep and mumbled something unintelligible. Catherine smiled and adjusted his blanket. A soft knock came at the door. She turned. Elena stood there holding a paper bag and 2 coffees. Catherine blinked. Then smiled properly. You came. Elena lifted one shoulder. I was in the neighborhood. Liar. Yes. They both laughed. Elena stepped inside and handed her one of the coffees. They sat together in companionable silence for a moment, watching Ellie sleep. Then Elena said, He looks stronger. He is. Good. Catherine looked at her. What happened after? Elena leaned back in the visitor chair. Victor's gone. Bianca's legal team is pretending they've never met her. 2 consultants are still crawling through the vendor mess. Half the people who used to think they were untouchable now answer emails with "per my last message." So, progress. Catherine laughed again. Thomas? Elena gave her a look. What about him? Catherine pretended interest in her coffee. Nothing. I just asked. Elena smiled into her cup. He's quieter. That surprised her. He was quiet before. No, Elena said. He was controlled before. That's not the same thing. Catherine looked at Ellie instead of responding. Elena let her sit in that silence for a second. Then said casually and very much not casually. He's trying to build something cleaner. Catherine frowned. Cleaner? Elena nodded. Less dependence on fear. More legitimate structure. Less rot hidden in ritual. A pause. He said something interesting in a meeting yesterday. Catherine looked over despite herself. What? Elena's smile was small. He said, if the people who carry the building know it's cracking before I do, then I've built the wrong kind of house. That landed somewhere deep. Because it was not just strategy. It was understanding. Too late for some things, maybe. But real. Elena stood after a while and set the empty coffee cup in the trash. She paused at the door. Then looked back. He asked me not to pressure you about the job. Catherine narrowed her eyes. Elena. What? You're impossible. And yet, Elena said lightly, you like me. Then she left. Catherine sat there smiling despite herself. Then looked down at the business card still tucked inside her paperback. She had not called yet. Not because she wasn't considering it. Because choice felt sacred now. And she intended to use it properly. 6 months later. The new office overlooked the river. Not because Catherine had asked for the view. Because Thomas Morty had a tendency to solve practical things with expensive gestures and then pretend he hadn't. She now worked 3 floors below executive level in a real office with a real title, real salary, and enough legal oversight to keep her conscience intact. Financial risk and compliance analyst. It sounded almost absurd if she thought too hard about it. But she was good at it. Very good. And perhaps the strangest part of all was this. She liked walking into a room and no longer being mistaken for decoration. The legitimate side of Morty Holdings was still imperfect. Still messy. Still built on foundations Catherine did not romanticize. But it was changing. Slowly. Intentionally. And whether Thomas admitted it aloud or not, some of that change had begun the night a waitress refused to stay silent. She saw him rarely. By design maybe. Or restraint. When they did cross paths, it was never cheap. Never rushed into something soft and convenient. No grand confessions. No dramatic kisses against glass windows. Just attention built carefully out of respect, interrupted silences, dry humor, and the dangerous intimacy of 2 people who had seen each other clearly at inconvenient moments. He had never pushed. Never assumed. Never used gratitude as leverage. And because of that. Because he gave her space instead of pressure. Something slower and more real had begun to grow between them. Not possession. Not fantasy. Trust. The hardest thing in the world. Especially for people like them. One Friday afternoon, Catherine left the office early to meet Ali at the park after his follow-up appointment. He was running now. Really running. Fast enough to make her chest seize for reasons entirely opposite from before. He kicked a soccer ball badly and proudly across the grass while shouting instructions to children who clearly had no intention of listening to him. Catherine sat on a bench laughing under warm sunlight. Then she felt it. That familiar awareness. She looked up. Thomas stood several yards away near the walking path, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, watching Ali with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not softness. Something rarer. Wonder. Like he still wasn't used to the idea that some things could survive. Ali spotted him first. That's your scary friend, he announced loudly. Catherine covered her face. Thomas, to his credit, took this with more grace than most men of his status would have. He approached the bench. Scary friend? Ali nodded seriously. You wear too much black. Thomas considered this. That's fair. Catherine laughed. And then, because the afternoon was warm and her brother was alive and the world had not ended when it very easily could have, the moment became easy. Natural. Earned. Thomas sat beside her on the bench, not too close. Never too close unless invited. Ellie returned to his game. And for a little while they simply watched him. The wind moved gently through the trees. The city carried on around them. Children shouted. A dog barked. A bicycle bell rang somewhere down the path. Ordinary life. The kind Catherine had once thought belonged only to other people. After a while Thomas said quietly, "You never answered me." She looked at him. "About what?" "The job." She smiled slightly. "I'm literally employed by you." "That's not the question." She knew what he meant. And he knew she knew. So she let the silence sit there for a second. Then said, "I'm still thinking." He nodded once. Not disappointed. Not impatient. Just there. That, she thought, might be the beginning of love in grown people. Not urgency. Not possession. The quiet presence of someone who could wait without punishing you for needing time. Catherine looked out across the park. At Illy. At the light. At the strange, hard, one shape of the life in front of her. And she thought how absurd it was that it had all begun with a scratched silver recorder under a couch. A hidden thing. A discarded thing. A truth waiting in the dark for someone invisible enough to find it. Maybe that was how power changed. Not always through kings. Not always through war. Sometimes through the people no one bothered to see. Sometimes through the waitress. Sometimes through the woman everyone thought would stay quiet. She turned slightly toward Thomas. Not all the way. Just enough. And for the first time, she let herself stop bracing for the future. Because whatever came next, she would choose it. Freely. Fully. Without fear. And in the end, maybe that was the deepest form of power anyone could ever hold. Final reflection. People often mistake silence for weakness. They think the quiet woman in the corner has no influence because she has no audience. But the truth is simpler and more dangerous than that. The people who are ignored see everything. And sometimes the one person powerful enough to save a life is the person no one thought mattered. So if life ever places truth in your hands, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's frightening, even when speaking costs you, remember this. Power can command fear. But only truth earns loyalty. And in the end, the strongest thing a person can do is choose what is right when no one would have blamed them for staying silent. If this story stayed with you, if Catherine's choice made you pause and think, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes quiet people can still change everything. And subscribe to the channel for more stories where the invisible become unforgettable. Because sometimes the softest voice is the one that saves a life.